me the grass is much greener.
Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome back to another countdown, and to the return of discussing the very interesting show As Told by Ginger, more specifically its second season. And oh boy, there's a lot to discuss. Season 1 was a decent season that I deeply respected for doing things no animated kids show was doing at the time, tackling some pretty complex issues that teens and kids could deeply relate to in a really raw and moving way, with some really nuanced characters who can be controversial but do a great job showing the quirks and growing pains of being a teenager. At the same time though, I could only really call this season decent because it was way too inconsistent throughout, and a lot of the episodes had writing and pacing problems, specifically when it came to actually incorporating some of these interesting ideas into an actual story to hold the episode runtime. I also felt like, for the most part, the Carl plots felt like an afterthought. And other than a few exceptions, at best, we're just kinda there, and at worst, really undermined Ginger's story, even in the best episodes. I am delighted to say, however, watching it again, Season 2 is an all-around better season than Season 1. And there are a lot of elements they do get better. Episodes are paced much better, the stories in general are stronger overall, they tackle even more complex and interesting topics relating to the teenage experience, which not only leads to more good episodes, but significantly better ones than in the first season. Because unlike Season 1, where even at its best I had some very sharp criticisms of certain elements, and I didn't think there was a single great episode, this season has multiple that I don't really have any complaints about. And there are some that tackle such unique but meaningful topics that I've honestly never really seen covered in a kids show before, or any show for that matter, which I'll get into next time. There's also other things that make this season an improvement over Season 1, like how much more development the characters and world get this time around, really fleshing both out, and we get to see some of these characters really start to change and grow and come into their own. It makes the show more fun to follow and the world more expansive, and uses the show's continuity and overarching narratives really well. And while I wish there was a bit more direct, overarching character development stuff around all this, and I just wish they went further with this element in general, it's still great, and not just for Ginger, or characters around her, but for someone like Carl as well. Rewatching this season, I finally understood Carl. I never disliked him and thought he was a likable character, but just didn't think the first season got great use out of him. But in Season 2, they really make him a much more interesting and even complex character, and actually create really fun stories around him that either play off of Ginger's stories well, or use him to just tell a damn good story all his own. And I'll definitely discuss this more when talking about individual episodes that more involve Carl. With all that said though, I can't really call this season anything other than decent as well, because while it has good and even great episodes, it also has a lot more bad episodes than Season 1. It's inconsistent in a completely different way than the first season was inconsistent, because there's not only more bad episodes, but the bad episodes are significantly worse than the ones in Season 1. About half this season is not great, if not outright bad, and even in some of the decent or good episodes, an amount of stories can still feel underwritten, leading to subject matters being underexplored for this reason. But when the season really fails, it's actually because it either goes all in on the worst idea ever, or because it takes a good idea and approaches it from the worst angle ever, leading to some truly awful but fascinating results, which I'm excited to talk about today. So with all that said, let's get right into this. Here is my list of the top 5 worst As Told by Ginger Season 2 episodes. So this one caught me off guard. When I watched it the first time, I thought it was an alright episode that I didn't have many thoughts on. Watching it again, I couldn't deny it was a bad episode, but didn't think it was that bad and doubted it would land on the worst list. When I actually sat down to make the worst list, however, I realized picking 4 through 1 was really easy, and for number 5, there were 3 bad but not really bad episodes vying for that number 5 spot. The other 2 I'll get into in the dishonorable mentions. And after thinking it over, I can't deny this is the worst of those 3, and the one I get the least out of watching. Once again, this episode is not terrible. I don't think the subject matter on paper is awful. The concept of having a crush on someone you know your close friend is also into as a teen, and some of the awkward feelings that can come out of that is not a bad thing to center an episode around. And the episode's setup to the story itself that tackles this issue is pretty decent. And because I did theater in middle school, I do enjoy some moments that show off the experience of how awkward and weird it can be, especially doing intimate moments with your co-lead and being that hormonal at that age, showing off awkward things that can come out of that. On that note, I also like some of the quieter moments with Ginger struggling to figure out what she's gonna do in this situation and just struggling with her new teenage hormones in general that she really hasn't had to deal with before now. That experience is a broad one every young teen has to face at some point, and it is a little compelling seeing Ginger deal with that. Here's the problem, however. This episode's story is actually kind of written like shit. So I believe Ginger would feel kind of weird about having feelings for someone that Dodie expressed being interested in first, especially at that age. But I have a hard time buying Ginger would be so torn up about this and so dogmatically follows this fake rule of not being able to go out with someone your friend has expressed interest in. The whole conflict stems from that idea, and it feels really forced. Ginger is a teenager who does buy into some strange things, but for her to so dogmatically follow this really silly logic doesn't feel within her character. So this conflict between Dodie and Ginger doesn't work. All it amounts to is Ginger denying she has feelings for this boy before kind of admitting to it, and then in a moment of passion doing something she regrets, which leads to an argument between Ginger and Dodie, and none of this works because not only is Ginger's mindset not believable, but the episode doesn't really get into her head that much to make this all that interesting or more believable. The episode doesn't even give us someone who disagrees with this perspective. Both Ginger and Dodie feel like Ginger is in the wrong, and it's really silly because it makes you think you're supposed to take this conflict seriously at face value, which is stupid. There's nothing wrong with Ginger liking someone and pursuing someone Dodie is interested in, especially if that person is interested in Ginger and not Dodie, which this episode makes very apparent. Yes, Ginger is in the wrong for deceiving Dodie about this topic, but that's not why the episode treats her like she did something wrong, because the story and conflict is so bad and incompetent. And while I do like the message of always being there for your friends and putting them above anything else, it's all centered around Ginger not getting with this guy who isn't into Dodie anyways, which is once again really silly. So the message itself doesn't work, and the episode's message should have been what I said earlier, that there's nothing wrong with pursuing someone your friend is also interested in, especially in this circumstance, or that you should even be transparent in situations like this and just tell your friends you feel the same way and work through that as friends, but this episode does neither. So yeah, this one is just an incompetent mess that isn't even that interesting for how messy it is and gives you so little to latch onto that it ends up being really boring. But still, because of the positives, it almost didn't end up on this list. But what definitely earned it this spot was the Carl plot being dull and not really adding anything, making this episode overall worse than some of its peers, even though the next 4 episodes are significantly worse. So here's an episode I didn't need to debate putting on this list at all, and I'm shocked that I couldn't put it any higher. The unpopular one from my understanding, and while it's got a lot of problems, there are really two big ones. Firstly, while the story of Ginger signing up for this band so she can go on this band trip to see Sasha is lame for reasons I'll get into in a little bit, a lot of this episode actually focuses on the ethics of if it's right for Ginger to be in this band in the first place. Just for this reason, especially if she isn't going to take any of this seriously, which is an interesting discussion to have, and a much better thing to center the episode around than its actual main story. But this episode goes about having this discussion in the worst way possible. Ginger's conflict with if it's right or ethical for her to be in this band, with how much time she spends thinking about Sasha, and how little time she actually puts into being in the band, is a mess. Because they want you to think they're having a serious conversation about it, but treat her role in the band like a joke. With her wearing this huge triangle she does literally one thing for, and they bring so much attention to that, and make the band kids and teacher seem like they're overreacting for caring so much about this triangle part's inclusion, and being kinda stuck up towards Ginger for not taking it that seriously. Even though this should be justified because Ginger should be taking this seriously. She really does only have one job, and all the other band kids take it seriously, and all this should lead to an interesting episode around this topic, but it doesn't because of how unseriously all this is portrayed. Neither of these jokes are funny, and it makes it confusing exactly what they want you to take away from this conflict. So it just means nothing and feels like a waste of time. And this is a decent chunk of the episode up until they actually go to Sasha's school. And this leads me back into the Sasha end of the episode. And yeah, it's not great either, and probably even worse because once again, Sasha is a bland character and a shallow person. He was last time, and he especially is here. You're still not given much of a great reason why Ginger would like him other than they had a thing for 5 seconds at the end of Summer of Camp Caprice, after he treated her in that episode in a super condescending and not great way, and even now hasn't returned any of her letters and continues to not treat her in a great way, giving every indication he is not interested in her. And it would be interesting if this episode actually showed off Ginger struggling to get over someone who she shouldn't be interested in, or more debating whether Sasha wants to see her or not and struggling with the fact that he definitely doesn't, or even getting in the head of someone with a misguided crush and showing us the reasons she is still obsessed with him, but they don't really do any of that. It's just Ginger being excited for the most part, and then her getting let down. And let's talk about that scene, because it is the worst part of the episode. I know people hate this scene because it's stupid and shocking for a character who apparently hated the idea of Ginger being stuck up and dating a popular boy to be dating a stuck-up popular girl. But honestly, it's not shocking, because this is how they've always written Sasha. He's a bland, shallow character the show has always written to fit whatever story they have around him. Why would a seemingly level-headed and thoughtful kid immediately assume Ginger is a stuck-up person based off the words of people he doesn't really know or respect and treat her poorly because of it? I don't know. Why would he date a stuck-up popular girl after how he acted in Camp Caprice? I don't know. He is just an underwritten bad character. His attitude in Camp Caprice and why he is so negative towards Ginger is never really elaborated on, but in that episode it seems like it stems from rejection from popular girls and just general distaste for them because of how they and popular boys treated him. But here, it doesn't make much sense with what's been presented before. It's revealed he actually acted that way because he was getting over a breakup with a stuck-up popular girl and got back together with her once he went back to school. Why? Because he's a poorly written nothing of a character and one of the show's worst. So this whole scene is super lame and just the cherry on top of how bad of a character Sasha is and why centering a story around him at all was a mistake. There's other things about this episode that don't work, like Carl's plot just not being that funny or interesting, and playing out in the most obvious way imaginable, but the biggest problems are the two I mentioned, and they make this one such a chore to sit through. But what kept this out of the top 3 is that for how much of a nothing burger this episode is, Miranda's moment with Ginger is really good. It's so interesting to see her kind of respect where Ginger is coming from in this episode, and her advice is really good. And I like this whole scene and how it shows that sometimes good advice like that can come from unexpected places. And I think this is especially powerful after someone Ginger thought highly of let her down. It's the only time this whole episode they get anything out of Sasha and Ginger's relationship in a meaningful and surprisingly introspective way. Sometimes life can be very unexpected and complicated like that, and as a teen, more than anyone, you often learn you need to be observant and take good advice where you can get it. Also, I do like how this episode captures the vibe of going on a school band trip like this. It's a very distinct experience that outside of the story itself, the episode does a good job showcasing. It has a really distinct vibe as someone who went on band trips that I really appreciate and feel at home with. So yeah, this one is trash, but there are 3 that are worse. This might be my hottest take on the list, and the biggest disagreement I have with big fans of the show. But I'm sorry, Lunatic Lake is trash. I love the concept of this one, as I think the idea it covers is a compelling and relatable one, of having friends with parents who are very high-strung and that you're not super fond of, but as a kid and teen, you're kind of at the mercy of in a lot of situations, which can make your relationship with your friends more complicated and difficult. But very little of this episode really works, and it just fails on all fronts. The pacing of the story is so bad. It takes a really long time to actually really tackle the subject matter this episode is about, and when they do, we start to see a bit of a conflict between Ginger and Joanne, but it doesn't really feel like Ginger should have a huge problem yet with her when she does. And her sympathy for Carl feels very out of nowhere. Like, yes, Joanne isn't a very nice or pleasant person to be around, and is in the wrong with her actions, but most of her wrath is directed at Carl. And then out of nowhere, the episode is about how Ginger has problems with Joanne and feels unwelcome. And while they try to spin it like she's also upset for how Joanne is treating her brother, this doesn't seem to bother her until the episode needs it to. As I said, most of this episode doesn't have any sort of conflict, with it just being about the girls going on this trip and Joanne being kinda high-strung and annoying. And then Ginger and Joanne start arguing, and they go out to find Carl and Hoodsy in the woods at night, which leads Dodie and Ginger to start fighting as well. And their conflict also feels really forced. Dodie says something mean about Carl offhandedly out of nowhere, and in a way that doesn't feel like something she would actually say at this point in the episode. She knows Hoodsy has acted like this in the past, and that Carl and Hoodsy are a troublemaking pair. So her putting all the blame on Carl and bad-mouthing him right to Ginger's face just feels so weird. And this leads to Ginger getting mad in an also super forced way, but then one scene later they make up and it's fine, so it really doesn't matter. That's honestly all this conflict is, and all the conflicts in this episode are. Joanne and Ginger's conflict feels forced, but she then just completely focuses on Carl, and then they go out into the woods to look for him in this really long and drawn out scene. That's just so awkward because not much is actually happening, and not much is ever at stake. And then they find Carl and Hoodsy, some chaos ensues, and then the episode's over and everyone goes home. Joanne doesn't learn anything about not being high-strung and rude. She doesn't change her mind at all. The girls' relationship doesn't change. Joanne doesn't really even speak with Carl or Ginger at the end. And while there is a message about how spending time with one's family amplifies all their positive and negative traits, and that's valuable in some way, It's such a nothing of a message, especially when this episode didn't really dive into anything interesting relating to Dodie's family to begin with. It just shows that Joanne is high-strung, which Ginger knew already, and the message is especially weak compared to pretty much any other message this season. This episode has other big problems that pile onto this, like Joanne also not being much of a character and just kind of being over the top and ridiculously high-strung in a not very specific or complex way. She's just rude and high-strung about even the most minor things. This episode has nothing to say about that other than that's just how she is. And as I said, she goes through no development, so it doesn't really matter. She's much more of an interesting character in other episodes, and they give her more of a reason for being high-strung there, even if it's obviously not justified. And just give her more personality in general in other episodes, but here she's just bland and annoying. All the other story beats just feel like they're kinda there and are underdeveloped to make this episode, and especially its back end, feel crazier and feel like it has more substance when it actually doesn't. Carl's plot is literally nothing. It's just there to make Joanne more mad. They're never in any danger. They don't make you care about this dumb movie they're filming. Carl should have a conflict with Joanne because that's who she is actually mad at, but he doesn't care about her, and they're not together for pretty much any of the episode, and don't really even speak. And Blake is also in this episode for 5 seconds, but contributes nothing and runs off in both scenes. The inclusion of this maniac is also so confusing, especially in a show that's pretty good at dealing with mental health. As you'll see in the next video, he's just really weird in the few scenes he's actually in, and contributes nothing to the story. It's just kinda awkward and uncomfortable. Also, this episode has the worst editing, and I guess stylistic choices of the show. There's so many strange transitions that actually don't look great, and feel kinda corny and cheap, making this episode even harder to take seriously. So yeah, this one's a disaster through and through, and I fail to see why anyone likes this one besides very surface level appeal, because there's just really nothing there. The only thing I think kind of works in this episode is that there's a few kind of funny moments, and I think the few times they're not focusing on any sort of conflict and just showing the girls having a fun time at this lake, it does a decent job capturing the feeling of going on a friend trip that you're really excited for, but might feel a little bit awkward on. It's the only part of this episode that is fun and true to life in an interesting way. Also, there is some decent atmosphere in this episode, but other than that, this episode is pretty irredeemable. But the next two are much worse. Oh man. So this episode is another level of terrible. We are getting into the episodes where pretty much nothing works. This episode has the weakest story of the entire season. Every plot beat feels so insanely contrived and forced. The teacher character who is rude to all the students and gives them these really draconian punishments for breathing isn't actually a character. There's no rhyme or reason for her to be acting like this. No logic behind when she punishes students and why. No goal of finding a better way to teach. The students don't ever learn anything. She just hates students and thinks they deserve to be treated this way. Which isn't actually interesting because it doesn't go much deeper than that. She is just a horrible monster who the students have no reason not to report. Teachers cannot act this way, especially at your traditional public school. This is a pretty gaping plot hole, along with this character essentially just being overly cruel for the sake of it, which makes the whole conflict awful and have no meaning to it. Who cares what these kids do to this teacher? Why would it change or mean anything? Also, Ginger's conflict on whether she wants to join in on TPing the teacher's house, and later if she wants to egg her or not, is a load of nothing. They don't have anything more to say on any of this other than, oh, I want to do these things because the teacher is mean, but nobody deserves this. It never goes any further than that. And whether anyone deserves this treatment, even someone who has done as bad of stuff as this teacher, or if Ginger is in the right or wrong in her choices, none of it matters because you know it won't mean anything, as I've already said. This teacher, once again, is not a character. Nothing phases her. She doesn't have anything that can be used to get her to stop treating the students like this, and the episode really makes it feel like the kids have no power over her. So what does any of this change, one way or another? Nothing, that's what. There are parts of this conflict that seem kind of interesting at first, but they don't go anywhere with any of them. Oh, it could be fun to see these kids go against this cruel sub, but they really can't. Oh, it could be cool to see Ginger get in the middle of this plan to get back at this teacher, creating enemies at the school, but that goes nowhere as well. And some scenes that could be really interesting, like the scene where Ginger saves the teacher from being egged, and the teacher doesn't really care, and the ending scene where she calls the teacher out, both could be cool moments that take the story in an interesting direction, but once again, because the story is shit, it's all pointless. All this episode amounts to is this boring teacher being cruel, which is infuriating, and the kids not being able to do much about it, so they spend all this time focusing on Ginger's complex, which is a load of nothing as well, because it's overly simple, and as I said, it doesn't mean anything either way, because every student gets punished all the same. And then finally, Ginger firmly stands up for herself, and gets detention, and the episode ends. You don't get to see what happens to the rest of the students or the teacher. The episode just stops. Just a pointless waste of time. Did I mention this was the season finale too? Kinda fitting, I guess, for how inconsistent this season could be. The Carl plot is also a load of nothing. It's just them boringly getting Brandon's monkey ready for this talent show with stuff he doesn't want to do, which leads to a very repetitive set of jokes, and just a retread of stuff and ideas we have already seen before in this season. I usually like this pairing, as you'll see later with Brandon, Hoodsey, and Carl, but they don't get much out of it here. So this plot has nothing to offer as well. Definitely one of the season's weakest Carl stories. Other than the setup being kind of okay, this episode is just unbearable to watch and has nothing going for it. Truly one of season 2's worst, and yet there is still one more episode to go. But before we get into what I consider to be the worst episode of the season, here are 5 dishonorable mentions. Like season 1, because the season isn't that long, I'm covering all the episodes in these lists, so you could consider these episodes 15 through 11 on a season ranking in no particular order. This episode is a weird one, because I feel like I'm generally more positive on it than most, despite having a lot of the same criticisms. The setup is extremely weak and underdeveloped. Ginger's motivation kinda makes sense of wanting to have a better image for herself to fit in because she is self-conscious, but the framing about how she doesn't want to be seen as a nice lame girl and just wants to seem cool is really weird. Despite being self-conscious, it feels like Ginger has become much more confident with who she is as a person, and such a simple framing device like this, it's something that the show should be pretty over with at this point. Also, the way they specifically talk about wanting to be cool doesn't have that much bite and just feels kinda lame and middle school drama-y. But the middle section at the high school party is great. It really nails that experience of feeling like you're so cool as a middle schooler going to this high school party, and just how much of a different feeling and vibe that all is. And how you think you're gonna do some crazy things, but all it amounts to is just feeling a little awkward and going home. Because you realize that's not actually the kind of person you are, like you see with Ginger. The scene under the table is great and really nails the teenage experience of trying to find who you are and what you feel comfortable with at that age for these reasons. This whole scene is great and is so interesting and brings the episode up a lot. But then the ending conflict is a whole lot of nothing, and the episode once again starts feeling like a bad middle school drama. Ginger not knowing what she wants her image and reputation to be could be really interesting, but it's just so underwritten here. They just don't go that far with the idea that maybe the image she thought she wanted, she actually didn't. And I do like the message of being more mindful and thoughtful of what you want your reputation to be, but also you shouldn't get so caught up in what people think of you. I think it's a bit more unique than what this episode's message could have been, but it's also sadly underwritten as well. Carl's plot is in one ear and out the other, but doesn't subtract from the episode that much. With all that said, I still generally like this episode for the good message and interesting showcase of this particular experience, and there is some interesting and well-written stuff with Ginger throughout that I can still call this one decent overall. This was very close to making it on the best list video, but its problems just held it back from that. On the other hand, this episode is trash. It's not the worst episode ever, but it was very close to being number 5 on the list proper. What inevitably kept it off the list is the fact that the Carl plot is great. Super interesting setup and very different pairing of characters with Carl, Hoodsie, and Mrs. Grippling, some fantastic jokes, and an interesting twist and message that make the kids really question who they are as people and what their priorities are when it comes to their personal conduct. It's nothing super deep, but it's pretty interesting and well done and plays into Carl's overarching growth and maturity this season, which I really love. But the Ginger plot is terrible. It's a generic story that goes exactly where you think it would. It's written like a bad middle school drama, similar to the last episode I talked about, but way worse. And while some elements could be interesting, like Ginger using the situation to get back at Miranda and struggling with it for moral reasons, especially when it blows up in her face, but they don't actually do anything with that. It's all just Miranda being super annoying until this conflict gets resolved with a quick fix at the end. It's really boring, and Miranda is such a jerk outside of this episode, and they don't do anything here to make her less of a jerk, so I don't actually really care what happens to her. The only other thing of note in this episode is that despite some of those girls seeming closer to Miranda, who are her and Miranda's friends in other episodes, she apparently has no status to remain friends with them outside of Courtney, which could be kind of interesting, but they don't do much with that either. So it kind of makes her a less interesting character and just paints her as a Courtney wannabe and nothing else, when she's promoted to be a lot more interesting than that in other episodes. And it's just another way that the episode fails because it exclusively focuses on her and tries to make her more interesting, but just makes her the least interesting version of herself in the entire show. It's not the biggest deal in relation to some of the episode's biggest problems, but it's just something else I thought of. This episode is so weird. I know people really don't like this one, and man, I definitely get it, but I don't know. I think the setup to this one isn't terrible. Ginger running this reformist brother and sister program to help troubled students that turns out horribly is fun, and I like the idea of her sicking the most absolutely awful and overly disciplined high schooler with Carl to prove the program works. Or at least I like this at first. It makes sense for her character, or for any older sibling, to do this situation when their younger sibling they don't usually see eye to eye with are being really annoying and causing trouble. Also, as much as I have conflicting feelings with George as a character, I think some of his initial scenes with Carl are pretty funny and interesting, just seeing Carl, who is usually in such control of every situation, just be at the will and mercy of this crazy military kid. Also, Carl in this episode is just great in general. His goal at the beginning of the episode is likable, even if he should probably be smart enough to know how stupid this plan is. And I really love his struggle at the end of the episode. Even with how much Ginger has kind of treated him badly in the episode, and them having a rocky relationship throughout the show, I think it's really cool to see him realize how much he loves and cares for Ginger, and for the first time, really tries to understand her perspective and where she's coming from in the situation they're currently in. Even if he thinks she is wrong and is suffering for it, he still understands her enough and respects her enough to decide to put up with the treatment he is given, which is really selfless and proves that he is a good person and just showcases what a great character he is and how nuanced and well thought out his development throughout the whole season, as it follows Carl's maturity and showcases him deciding what kind of person he really wants to be and what values are important to him. And this scene really exemplifies that perfectly. Even if I wish we could have focused on this development and built up to this scene more throughout the entire episode. But they still do get some really interesting moments developing the siblings' relationship, and at the end, they have a great scene where they have a heart-to-heart and try to understand each other more, showing they both could work on this, which is well done and just once again so fascinating. The element really is the strongest of the episode. Where this episode really fails is in Ginger's portrayal. Her idea and ambition make sense for her character, even if her idea is flawed, and I can see her being a little defensive of her idea once it starts to fail, especially at that age. But for her to get this in denial about how much of a brutal failure this program is, and continue to use her brother as an example of it working, while he is clearly telling her that he is being treated really poorly, is really stupid and out of character and just kind of gross and unpleasant to watch. And that's a lot of what this episode is. The program being proven to be terrible time and time again, and Ginger, instead of shutting it down or even just making changes, just putting her head in the sand and ignoring it. Also, just how badly this program fails is shown off in the most over-the-top and hand-fisted way possible. It's really lame, and it makes it seem like any reform program that prioritizes reform and rehabilitation over punishment is doomed to fail, which just isn't true, and is a gross sentiment that this episode contributes to. This all makes Ginger's inner conflict mean nothing, and this episode be boring at best and infuriating at worst. Also, on Carl's end, the setup with his story is very long and drawn out, and while I like some of his conflict with George, I do think George feels like less of a character and more like a plot device, and after a while, Carl's conflict with him can just feel like he's being punished by George over and over again with no real way out. There are still fun scenes of him trying to get one up on George, but it's not all great. With all that said, though, I end up falling pretty in the middle with this one, honestly leaning upwards, thanks to some of the fun and interesting Carl stuff, and when they do explore his dynamic with Ginger, especially their last conversation together, that conversation and scene is just so much more interesting than pretty much anything else any of the episodes on the list proper have to offer, or really anything in the honorable mentions as well. But this episode still deserved a mention here for its problems. This is another episode I feel similarly to the last one in that it's on the higher end of okay, but just has a lot of problems keeping me from calling it good, even if it's for different reasons. I don't think this premise is bad at all. Ginger and her family going through a bit of a rough patch, leading to her being embarrassed by her family and the way they act and just their status in general, which is an interesting and even relatable thing for a lot of teens for this show to tackle. Also, some of the Friday the 13th stuff on Carl's end is pretty fun, leading to some good gags. Also, them staying at the Bishops and Ginger staying with Courtney is interesting, and they get some really cool stuff with her staying with the Gripplings, and we get to see how cold that family lives and just how distant they are from each other, making her appreciate her own family more. I also like the stark contrast of just the environment of Ginger's torn down house because of this outbreak to the very clean, even sterile, and gorgeous house that the Griplings have, to really demonstrate why Ginger would want that kind of life living with their family, which makes the revelation that Courtney's family isn't perfect and they're not as close as Ginger is with her family really effective. The drawback to this episode is that Ginger's perspective on all of this, just in general, is boring. She feels like a generic teenager who is just annoyed at everything. She's not a very distinct character or an interesting one, or anywhere near as thoughtful, well written as she usually is. It makes this episode less interesting than it should be, and this isn't helped by the fact that they don't do a lot with either group staying at someone else's house, especially the one on the Bishop's end. They do pretty much nothing. Carl and Hoodsey don't even hang out, and they could develop Lois and Joanne's relationship, which is a really interesting one, but they just don't. There's some alright moments, but that's it. And while the message is good, it's nothing that deep or complex, especially for this show, and because of how simple Ginger's perspective is on all of it, that doesn't help the message either. 1 minute, everything with her family just kind of annoys her, and then she has one weird experience with the Griplings and appreciates her family more. That's just how the episode plays out in practice. And while that's not unrealistic, it's just not compelling enough to center a whole episode around. But as I said, they do make some smart choices to make this more interesting and well put together, and do explore some more interesting stuff surrounding how weird and distant Courtney's family truly is, which does bring this episode up a lot. So I do like this one more than I don't. It's just too hit or miss for me to call it any sort of good. This episode was very close to making the list proper, because the Ginger and Courtney plot is terrible. It goes nowhere, says nothing, does nothing with any interesting ideas it does have, like Courtney maybe realizing she doesn't need to be popular to be cool and happy, which could be an easy continuation of her character arc throughout the show. But no, this episode has the most stock, generic teen drama plot you will ever watch, and it's either painfully generic or just outright dreadfully boring. Ginger helps this girl become popular like Courtney, but oh no, she ends up becoming more popular and taking the spotlight away from Courtney, and then Courtney becomes a mess who forgets how to be popular and be herself, which is such a lame twist, and once again, a generic and predictable one for this kind of story to take, which makes Courtney a less interesting and dynamic character. And then Ginger decides to help Courtney become popular again, but in the end, Courtney and Hope make up and join forces to be popular together, and Ginger gains nothing by helping anyone, because of course, that's how a horrible generic episode like this would end. There's just nothing here of substance, Hope isn't an interesting character, and she never comes back in any interesting way after this. Courtney goes through no development, her story means nothing, Ginger doesn't have that much stake in any part of the story, and doesn't have an interesting perspective on any of the change that is happening in any way either. Also, her stake they try to give her in the story is really lame and simple. Macy and Dodie are just there and don't contribute much either. This episode is just a pointless mess, and would have easily landed on this list, probably pretty high, if it wasn't for how amazing the Carl plot is. Quite possibly the best of the season. Maybe even the show, though I don't feel very confident about that. It's so interesting seeing Carl and Hoodsey realize they miss their teacher, Mrs. Gordon. Not just because they enjoy their dynamic with her, but because they realize once she is gone, she was just an interesting and cool person, which is such a great revelation, which makes them both feel like more complex characters who are growing and changing, playing into the season's arc so well. This might be Carl's most definitive moment all season for that,
where we really get to see him mature and understand the people around him more, even authority figures who he usually opposes, to become the most fleshed out and best version of himself he can possibly be. The scenes where they try to get her back are just really fun and cute, especially the great song scene near the end that is just so sweet and amazing, which makes it actually so devastating when they reveal her death. Honestly, one of the most sad and hardest hitting moments of the show. I was shocked at how much this episode made me care for this minor character I really didn't have a crazy ton of feelings on beforehand, and her relationship with Carl and Hoodsey, which wasn't the strongest by any means, and just, it really made me care, truly. Just a great subplot and a loving tribute to the real-life voice actress, Kathleen Freeman, who was fantastic in this show. But as great as the story is, it's still a very minor part of a pretty terrible episode. Though it did end up being good enough to keep this episode off the list proper. But with all that said, let's finish this list and finally get into what I consider to be the worst episode of As Told by Ginger, Season 2. So I know this episode is not liked, and most people would easily put it on their worst list, but I don't know how many people would put it at number 1, above something like Driven to Extremes. But I do think this episode is worse than that one and has way less redeeming about it. And here's why. So this episode follows Ginger having a serious crush on her teacher and complications that come out of this. Now, I've stated in the past, I'm not a fan of these types of stories and feel like, well, it's not impossible to get something interesting out of having a character have a harmless crush on a teacher, as it's not an uncommon experience, and episodes that shed light on it can be fine, if not good, if it's shown as a small harmless thing and a small part of some sort of bigger story or experience. Like in Lisa's Substitute, where the episode is actually about the legitimately great dynamic she has with Mr. Bergstrom and how this makes her question her relationship with her own father, who isn't there for her. Her having a crush on Mr. Bergstrom is a minor throwaway bit in the episode that sort of develops their relationship, but is more used for a couple gags. On the other hand, Crush on Teacher from Hey Arnold focuses exclusively on Arnold's crush on his substitute teacher, and that episode is bad, for many reasons. But the biggest thing is that it's just kind of boring. There's just not a lot to do with this topic. But Next Question is a million times worse than Substitute Teacher, because this episode is a 20-minute slog, where Ginger, who is a teenager mind you, has strong feelings for her teacher, and the entire episode is her just being encouraged by her friends that this is a great thing, and that she should pursue him, and that he might be interested in her, and that her being in a relationship with him is this great normal thing. And dear God, there's a lot of problems with this episode. First off, I think Ginger is out of character, and not this dumb and naive. Ginger is too old to be having this kind of a crush, and for it to be this cute, meaningless thing. If she actually thinks it's normal to have a crush on a teacher to a point where she wants to pursue him and go out with him, then that's really bad. And situations like that are what lead to children, especially teenagers, getting taken advantage of. And while obviously this kid show is never gonna be that explicit of that being the reason why Ginger shouldn't do these things, either way throughout the episode, no one pushes back on Ginger wanting to pursue a grown man and why it is wrong, and just flatly not okay on its face. But I'll get back to this in a second, because this is a really big problem that just destroys the entire episode inside and out. But there's something else I want to cover. There are a couple other problems I want to discuss before I get back into that major one. No matter what the ethics or moral implications of all this is, Ginger herself doesn't have an interesting perspective on any of this, or struggle with this situation or these feelings at all. She feels kind of weird about it and then warms up to it the more her friends talk about it. In terms of an actual conflict or story, this episode has none. We also need to talk about Dodie's role in this episode, which starts to get back into the most major problem the episode has. Look, Dodie is a character I believe would be naive enough to not only think all this was just great and normal, which would lead to her to impart bad advice to Ginger around this topic, like the teacher might totally like you back and you should shoot your shot, but the entire episode treating what she has to say as legitimate and having merit to it until the end is dumb, because it's not only boring, because it's obviously not true, but there's no actual interesting look at why this isn't true, or why Ginger would be wrong to take this advice. And the episode doesn't have an interesting conflict with alternating perspectives around any of this. But it's also just really uncomfortable, because once again, situations like this can lead to some pretty horrid stuff. Well, obviously, it doesn't go there, as Ginger just gets embarrassed, and that's that. There's a lot of situations where that's not the case in real life, because a kid doesn't have the understanding of why things like this are inappropriate and don't have good guidance and meet people like a teacher or authority figure who will take advantage of them. This is a serious and legitimate problem. And while the episode never feels like Ginger could end up fully in a situation like that, it just sucks that the episode shows the same kind of situation where many teens do end up in pretty horrible circumstances, and the episode doesn't have any tact to criticize steps that get a kid there. This is especially why the ending sucks. First off, it's so cringe and uninteresting, and once again makes Ginger feel like her IQ went down 1 billion points, why she would think it's a good idea to ask him on TV during a huge competition they all care so much about. That's not something Ginger would do in any other episode. But the moral at the end is not only painstakingly simple, but also undercooked and not super well explained. Dodie, who really gave Ginger rancid advice, gets no comeuppance or lessons that this stuff isn't okay. That it's not good to have a serious crush on an adult as a teen and try to act on it in the way the episode is presented. And the only thing Ginger is told is that she's trusted to have better judgment in the future after something so embarrassing came out of this, but she clearly didn't have great judgment before, and I wish the episode was more firm with how wrong this whole situation was, and how Ginger shouldn't do stuff like this again in the future. Just so boring, awful, and uncomfortable. And I haven't even mentioned yet how the Carl plot is the worst of the season. The pairing of Carl and Hoodsie with Brandon is always a fun one, and there's some kind of funny moments, but this plot of them using the groundhog to sell merchandise is really lame, and then it escapes, and Brandon's monkey goes crazy, and then Carl kinda stops anything too bad from happening, and then the story just kinda stops. Once again, just a waste of my time. This episode is irredeemable garbage. It has so many problems, with nothing bringing any of it up, and worst of all, it tackles a serious and even really interesting and compelling topic that should be covered with care to give a positive and great message to kids that they could use in a valuable way, but not only has nothing to say about anything, but also refuses to really speak out against why situations like this aren't good. And look, Ginger does realize the situation was not good and that the advice parted her way wasn't great, so it doesn't promote anything bad. That's not what I'm accusing this episode of at all. There are no bad morals that kids could take out of this one. I don't hold any blame against any of the creators for some of the bad implications of this, but it doesn't do the legwork to promote anything good out of all this either, which is pretty damning, making this one exceptionally bad and the worst of Season 2. And with all that said, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more content similar to this in the future. Leave me a comment down below telling me what you thought of my video and what your own list would have been. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one, and the top 5 best As Told by Ginger Season 2 episodes list will be coming soon. And with all that said, take care.